Sony announced recently when they were talking about the PS5 Pro that 75%, 3 out of every 4 gamers choose the performance mode or the high frame rate mode over the graphics mode when given the choice. And all I gotta say is, duh? Like, seriously? Obviously, any serious gamer is going to choose the performance of the game, the way it plays, over how shiny it is, or how many reflections there are in puddles on the road, or whatever. We need the game to run. We need the game to function. And this debate over 30 frames versus 60 frames versus some, PC players playing at much higher frame rates, a lot of people get really upset about this debate because they're defending their plastic box of choice. And, me being a Nintendo Switch lover, I am willing to accept 30 frames a second in a handheld context. I'm willing to accept that with the limitations of the hardware, but I don't have to like it. I have something like the ROG Ally here, for example, which gives me 60 frames a second in most of the older games that I play, most of the indie games, no problem. I can even get up to 120 frames a second on this thing in a lot of indie games. And I can tell you the difference is night and day. And the point of this video that I want to make is opening a discussion about the way that games are developed in the first place. Because I don't really understand what developers are thinking when it's absolutely clear that 3/4 of gamers, when given the choice, prefer better performance in their games. And why wouldn't you? Of course, prefer for your game to run smooth, for the frame rate to be good. It's not just about the visuals, it's about the performance. When the best test for how well the frame rate and frame pacing are going, if you're in a 3D game, you stand still and you just rotate the camera around and around and around you. The question is, how much motion blur is there? At 30 frames a second, everything's going to be smeared. You're not going to be able to make out details as things rotate around your character. At 60 frames per second, it's going to be much smoother. You're going to be, much less motion blur. And why that matters is because when you are moving quickly in a 3D game, particularly open world or 3D game, first person shooter or something, the clearer things are, the more you're going to be able to discern something that's small, like a sniper up in that window as you're moving around. Whereas if everything's blurred, it all blends together, right? So why don't developers start with 60 frames per second as the baseline and build the whole game around that concept? For me, as a content creator, and I know it's not exactly the same, but there are similarities between video creation and video game creation. So when I create a YouTube video, the very first thing I do when I'm grabbing my camera equipment is choose. Do I want this to be at 24 frames a second, or 30 frames a second, or 60 frames a second? And then I choose what resolution I want. Do I want 720p? Do I want 1080p? Do I want 4K? Do I want ProRes? Or do I want HVEC? I make all these choices at the very beginning of the product. Right now, as I'm sitting here, I'm recording this in 1080p, 30 frames a second. Why? Because I've made the choice that is the most efficient way to deliver my product quickly with slow internet and still have a pretty high quality product at the end of the day uploaded to YouTube. Why can't developers do this same thing? I carry this through from my camera to my editing software. And if I'm making an animation or something, I make it in the same frame rate. When you set up your editing project in your software, you choose the project settings. You say, I want this to maintain the settings of the video, or I want it to be 60 frames, or I want it to be a different aspect ratio. You choose all these things at the beginning of the project, and then you build the whole project around those settings. Why do game developers not do this? I understand with limitations of something like the Nintendo Switch that you have to make choices to get, the best compromise between visuals and performance on something like the Nintendo Switch. But with a console like the PS5 or the Xbox Series X, they have enough performance headroom that they could start with the idea of 60 frames per second. We see on the Xbox One and Xbox 360 games running at like 120 frames per second with frame boost on. And why do games need to look particularly better than they did in the Xbox One era? If I could just have games that looked like Xbox One games and ran way better, that would be so much better than games that have ray tracing. Who cares? Ray tracing's dumb anyway. Why do we want ray tracing so bad that we're willing to sacrifice the performance of the game to the point where things are jerky, things are stuttering, you have frame rate fluctuations and drops? Every time it drops from 30 to 22nd, you get a little stutter, a little frame hitch. It's really annoying and it breaks immersion. Nothing maintains immersion more than a steady frame rate, even if it's 30 frames per second. But if you have got drops, frame drops, hitches, and stitches in there, you've got stuff like VSync issues and stuff, this stuff drives gamers crazy. It breaks immersion when all of a sudden there's a jagged line through my graphics or something because the VSync is not working right or something. I do not understand why, when we have proven time and time again that we value performance. PC gamers will choose 1080p over 4K because they want 160 frames a second. I do it all the time. I game modern stuff, 1080p or 2K all the time. I have a laptop in the other room with a 3060 in it. I can run stuff at 4K 30 if I want to, but I will usually choose 1080p and 60 or 120 frames a second anytime over 4K, because those graphics, when you're in motion, don't really make that much of a difference anyway. Anyways, what do you guys think about this whole conversation? I wanted to come in here because I want to ask you, why are developers not starting from ground zero, setting up their editing software as 60 frames a second, and then building the game from there? If as you're building a game, if you put some textures into the game that slow that frame rate down, you should be able to know right then and there, okay, let's dial the resolution back on these textures, or let's pull back the draw distance, or whatever you need to do to maintain that solid, rock solid 60 frames a second. This is not me being a frame snob here. I think in 2024 it is completely inexcusable for anything to be less than 60 frames a second. As we see the new Switch 2 coming out, I do not need Switch games to look better. Mario Odyssey looks fine. Zelda Breath of the Wild looks fine. Sure, maybe a little resolution boost would be nice, but when I play a 1080p game on my 4K TV, the 4K TV has upscaling algorithms in it anyway. It already looks fantastic. The Switch mostly looks fine. The problem with the Switch is the performance. The problem with the Switch is the fluctuating frame rates. The problem with Breath of the Wild is that it drops down to 25 frames a second when you're in Kakariko Village or whatever, and it's just not okay anymore. These developers need to start with a framework of performance, an expectation that is hard-coded into the game that this runs at 60, period. There is no fluctuations. Whatever you build into the game has to fit into that framework. I understand that there are a few people out there that don't care. I understand that 25% of people, probably most of which are not savvy enough to even know the difference between the settings and just play whatever the default is, but 25% of people apparently don't care. But that leaves 75% of people who do care, and I think it's pretty irresponsible of these developers to constantly be trying to push this graphics envelope that makes these consoles obsolete faster than they ever need to be. There is no reason for games to keep getting better and better and better. Well, better's the wrong word. There's no need for games to keep pushing the envelope year after year after year, trying to get more complex, to get more visually whatever. If a game looked good like Mario Odyssey on the Switch in the first year of the Switch, there is no reason that 7 years later you can't still design a game the same way to run with the same performance as you did 7 years ago. Nothing changes in the pipeline, of game development that requires things to be more demanding just because a few years have gone by. Sure, maybe you change to a new gaming engine, a new game design engine or something, and maybe it is a little more demanding. I know a lot of consoles are having problems with Unreal Engine 5 games at present, but I think that's an optimization issue with that game engine. I don't think that really has anything to do with the consoles themselves. Anyways, guys, what do you think about this topic? Let me know down in the comments. Am I being a frame rate snob here, or am I just expecting game developers to give me a quality product at this point? One thing that should be mentioned is frame pacing, because two different games that have 30 frames a second can be very different depending on the frame pacing. Some appear smoother than others, and Nintendo is actually really great with this, and some 30 frames per second games can be quite playable and enjoyable. Like I say, I'm not really being a snob here, but it's absolutely clear that higher frame rates give you a better, smoother, cleaner experience in your game. Gives you lower latency, you're able to control things better, you're able to hit smaller targets faster. I don't know. It just seems ridiculous in 2024 with these consoles. We're looking the PS5 Pro dead in the face, and they're still talking about Digital Foundry reports of some games running at 30 frames per second, or having to be massively downgraded to like 864p if you want 60 frames a second. And it's crazy. I mean, the Switch is running a lot of games at 900p. The Switch, we're talking about the PS5 Pro here, and it can't do as well as the Switch if we want 60 frames a second. There's a serious issue with optimization here, and I think it has to do with the fact that these developers are not starting from day one with 60 frames in mind. I see so many of these games that launch a broken, buggy mess, and they launch at 30 frames a second with all kinds of performance issues, and then maybe 4, 5, 6 months down the line, all of a sudden they get a 60 frames patch. The games are just launched, not optimized, and not really ready for consumption because they want to get their hands on the money from the sales of the game, which I understand. But if you can do it 6 months from now, you could have done it from day one. That's my point. You could have started with 60 frames at the beginning of the project. I really think these companies, I don't know who's making these decisions, and I'm kind of rambling here, but If you can patch a game to run at 60 frames per second 6 months later, you could have done it in the first place. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for subscribing and listening to my long, exhausting, boring rants. Have a good day. Stay classy.